Hello, and welcome to Home Movie Day, a celebration of amateur films and filmmaking from Emory's collections. We're glad you can join us. I'm Nina Rao, audiovisual conservator for Emory Libraries, and with me here today to talk about home movies and Emory's collections is Laura Starratt, senior collections archivist in Rose Library. You may be wondering, what exactly is Home Movie Day? Home Movie Day is a series of events that take place all around the country and beyond to celebrate and exhibit home movies. Each October, individuals and families gather at Home Movie Day events to view these unique films and share them with their neighbors and community. We hope today's screening will be an opportunity to explore some interesting film from Emory's collections, consider film as a window into history, and talk a little bit of the work of film preservation. And perhaps you might have home movies of your own, so at the end we'll also talk about how to care for your home movies and keep them safe for future generations. Before we get started, when we say home movies, the type of film we're talking about are motion pictures created by individuals primarily for an intended audience of family and friends within the immediate circle of home. The films were usually edited, viewed, and stored in a home setting, and the type of film used would typically be 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, or Super 8. Our first film today is from the James Vinson Carmichael collection in Rose Library. James Vinson Carmichael was an Atlanta businessman and attorney and Emory alumnus. During World War II and in the post-war period, he served in various roles at Bell Aircraft Corporation, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, and Scripto. He also served 2 terms as a Georgia legislator. There are several home movies in the Carmichael collection. Most of them are films of family vacations and holidays, and they have titles like Christmas 1948 or Florida Vacation. However, one reel among the collection was simply labeled Portrex, which raised some curiosity. What was Portrex? Upon inspection, the reel appeared to be footage of Navy ships and military exercises, which raised more questions than it answered. Was this really a home movie? And if so, how did James Carmichael end up in the middle of an apparent military battle? Or was this perhaps a home movie shot by someone else? For answers to these questions, we turned to the papers in the Carmichael collection and determined that this was indeed a home movie shot by James Vinson Carmichael of a military training exercise known as Operation Portrex. Portrex took place in March 1950 on Vieques Island off the coast of Puerto Rico. It was a joint airborne amphibious training exercise conducted by the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and at the time was the largest peacetime war games ever conducted by the U.S. military. Although official footage of Portrex exists in the National Archives and Records Administration, Carmichael's home movie stands out as a civilian record of the event, and also possibly some of the only color footage of Portrex. Accordingly, through a grant from the National Film Preservation Foundation, we preserved Portrex with new film elements and a digitization of the original reel, and are happy to be presenting the digital version here at Home Movie Day. So without further ado, here is Portrex. From what we know, Carmichael was invited by telegram to attend Portrex from March 1st through March 9th. On February 28, 1950, he traveled by train from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. The next morning, March 1st, which I think is what we're seeing here, he embarked by air from Andrews Field to Norfolk, Virginia, where he boarded the USS General H.W. Butner, which was both his transport to Puerto Rico and also his accommodation for the duration of Portrex. So this is footage of the USS Butner. On the passenger list for the ship, he's listed under civilian guests as J.V. Carmichael of Scripto Incorporated. So presumably he was invited in his capacity as president of Scripto, as opposed to his earlier role with Bell Aircraft. He was assigned to stateroom 260 and lifeboat station 10. This is footage of the journey from Norfolk to Puerto Rico. Many of the ships involved in Portrex also originated at Norfolk, and that's probably what we're seeing here. It seems to have been about 5 to 6 days at sea. We know he had an invitation to cocktails at the Officers Club of the U.S. Naval Station in San Juan for March 6th at 5 p.m., so presumably he would have arrived by then. Amenities aboard the USS Butner included a dining room serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner, tea and coffee hours after each meal, laundry, soda fountain, barbershop, post office, library, lost and found, medical services, a lounge deck with blankets, a Sunday worship service, nightly motion pictures, and also a daily newsletter, the Butner Bulletin, with a roundup of sports news, weather, politics, and world events. So here is that lounge deck. The premise of Portrex was that an invasion force representing the United States would be attempting an airborne and amphibious invasion of Vieques Island, while a defense force representing a fictitious nation known as aggressor would be opposing the invasion. The main events of Portrex were to take place on March 8th. The amphibious attack force would land on Vieques, and airborne troops would parachute in to link up with them and secure the beaches with support from naval ships and the Air Force. This is probably March 8th, the invited guests heading to their first observation point on the island. Carmichael was observing primarily the aggressor side of the exercise. If his observer schedule is accurate, he would have arrived at observation point 1 at 7:30 a.m. to witness the airdrop. This is Carmichael with other invited guests. The papers in the Carmichael collection include the Observer's Handbook for Portrex, as well as several packets of information about the units participating and the schedules for each day. According to a news clipping from the time, Portrex involved 80,000 military personnel, 162 ships, 600 aircraft, and 1,800 umpires who made decisions about the outcomes of individual actions throughout the exercise. So now this is the invasion force arriving with paratroopers. The first paratroopers arrived around 8 a.m. on the morning of March 8th. At 8:45 a.m., Carmichael was to have moved to observation point 2, known as Red Beach, to observe amphibious landings by the invasion force. So this is likely now that second observation point. As they would be observing most of the day's events from land, guests of Portrex were advised to include in your apparel a windbreaker and a pair of stout shoes for wear on the beachhead. They were also told that personal cameras were allowed, so presumably this included personal movie cameras, and that is how we came to have the reel that we're watching right now. The defense force opposing the invasion, known as aggressor, was actually largely troops from Fort Riley, Kansas. Portrex was the latest in a series of training actions featuring aggressor as a fictitious nation with its own history and ambitions as a means of eliminating any reference to an actual country or people. They had distinctive uniforms, tactics, weapons, and equipment. They wore green uniforms with ridged helmets. Their flag was a green triangle on a white field. Their vehicles and planes are supposed to have had the same markings, but since most of the vehicles we're observing are actually invasion vehicles, it's a little bit hard to tell. The role-playing went so far as to include a welcome letter to guests, which is in the Carmichael files, purportedly from the aggressor forces, which read, "Aggressor welcomes its distinguished guests. Never since the island of Vieques was annexed by the aggressor republic have we been honored by having as our guests such a distinguished group of neutral observers. We bid you welcome and hope that you enjoy your stay. The Defense Force for Portrex was also notable for including the 65th Infantry Regiment, which was composed mainly of Puerto Rican soldiers and was one of the last segregated units in the US military. The 65th Infantry had been part of the US Army since 1908, but had been kept from combat roles due to racial segregation policies. During Portrex, however, the regiment proved to be extremely successful at repelling the invasion forces, and later in 1950 went on to distinguished combat service in the Korean War. In 2016, the 65th Regiment was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for its exceptional devotion to duty and service in the Korean War. The third observation point was called the VIP Hill. It's pretty close to the observation point for Red Beach, so it's a little unclear how much of the footage is shot there, but Carmichael would have arrived there at 10:45 a.m. to view attack and defense ground actions and then remain there for the rest of the day. Lunch was served at noon, and briefings on the action were given to guests at 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. Portrex was apparently also notable for the large number of invited guests. A New York Times reporter estimated at least 700 observers, writing, quote, "The number and variety of observers is unprecedented in this correspondent's memory and has aroused considerable comment, particularly in view of the recent economy budget of the armed forces. Only about 113 of the, quote, guests represent newspapers, radio stations, or magazines, and of these, probably less than half represent daily papers." The article goes on to single out a few representatives of industry, including the Niagara Falls Power Company, the Hartford Trust Company, and Scripto Incorporated. So this is probably guests returning to the USS Butner at the end of the day on March 8th. From there, the ship must have returned to San Juan. According to Carmichael's itinerary, he returned to Washington, D.C. the following day, March 8th, by air from San Juan. So this appears to be the USS Butner docked. You can just make out the number 113 on the side of the ship. The rest of this footage is presumably shot in and around San Juan between Carmichael's arrival after observing Portrex on March 8th and his departure the following morning. So I'm just gonna let the rest of the reel play out from here. For anyone who might be interested in reading more about the observer experience of Portrex, there is lots of accompanying documentation in the Carmichael papers. And again, we are really glad to have been able to preserve this reel. Okay, and now I'm going to turn this next to Laura.
Hello, I'm Laura Starratt. I am the Senior Collections Archivist at the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, and I'm very excited to be talking about the William Levi Dawson home movie of his trip to West Africa. Now, I do want to note that this film was reformatted and is available due to support from the National Preservation Foundation grant, as you will see at the start of this movie. To start, I do want to give a little background on Dawson as we start. William Levi Dawson was an African-American composer, conductor, educator. He was born in Anniston, Alabama in 1899. His parents were George W. and Eliza Starkey Dawson. George was a day laborer and a former slave, and he and Eliza had 7 children. William was the oldest. At 13, William Dawson left home and attended the Tuskegee Institute, where he earned money for tuition by working in the agricultural division of the college. In addition, he was a member of the Institute band, the orchestra, where he learned to play most of the instruments. He also joined the choir and traveled with the Tuskegee Singers. Dawson graduated from the Tuskegee Institute in 1921 with highest honors. He earned a bachelor's degree in music from the Horter Institute of Fine Arts in Kansas City, Missouri, and a master's degree from the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago in 1927. He returned to the Tuskegee Institute in 1930 following a series of teaching roles in the Kansas City school system. He came back to the Institute to start their School of Music. In addition to his administrative role, he conducted the Tuskegee Institute Choir, bringing it to national prominence. They performed for Presidents Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. In 1932, he conducted the Institute's choir during the months-long engagement of the opening of the International Music Hall of Radio City, or as we know it, the Radio City Music Hall. And then in 1946, he broke the race barrier by having the first African-American choir perform at the Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C. Dawson's best-known works are arrangements of and variations on spirituals. However, his Negro Folk Symphony of 1934 garnered a great deal of attention at its world premiere, which had Leopold Stokowski directing and the Philadelphia Orchestra performing. In his work, Dawson used the melodic and rhythmic language borrowed from African-American spirituals, along with original material composed by Dawson of the same idiom. The symphony was revised in 1952 after a trip to West Africa that Dawson took while on sabbatical from the Tuskegee Institute. He added African rhythms inspired by what he said was an attempt to convey the missing elements that had been lost when Africans came into bondage outside their homeland. Emory received the William Levi Dawson papers in 2001 from Dawson's nephew. There were about 50 linear feet of musical arrangements and also 75 linear feet of records, tapes, photographs, books, correspondence, and general manuscript material describing his work as a composer and arranger, choral director, and also as a faculty member of the Tuskegee Institute. For Home Movie Day, we are going to focus on a film from his 1952 trip to West Africa. This film covers his time in Liberia and the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. Unfortunately, as you might notice, there is no sound in this film, but Dawson did actually make recordings of performances on his trip, audio recordings, that are also held in the Rose Libraries collection and are available for research, or if you're just curious. A lot of the information I'm going to bring in comes either from the collection, Dawson's diary, as well as other information that I found using YouTube to compare dance styles, history, and music. It's important to note that I'm not an expert on music or Western Africa. In many cases, when you do work in an archives or when you research in an archives, there's always the option for you as a researcher to support your organization with the knowledge that you have. Okay. And so now we're going to start the video. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of information on this performance, this scene. But if you do notice in the background, there's a building with a sign that says, and this is my poor French, Marbourg's Alimentation Générale, which I looked up and is actually French for Marbourg's grocery store. Now, according to the itinerary that that was provided in Dawson's collection, he did have a stopover in Dakar, Senegal, which is one of the only few countries that I could find that he visited that had French as its language. But this is obviously a public gathering. There are people all around. There are children running around. At one point, you'll see a car driving by in the background. People are wandering around, walking. So I don't think this is necessarily something that was, ceremonial. The women are all wearing white robes, but they look like they are placed over their everyday clothing. And, it seems very active and energetic. As you can see, there is a group of men in the middle who are the drummers. I can see someone wearing a fez, which was a very popular style for military at that time in this area. So when I first looked at it, I saw, a lot of kind of shuffling. So I assumed these were older women, but as you can see, it does get really lively in a lot of parts. So this could be a group of a variety of ages. But again, I'm not sure if this is a parade or a performance or some kind of ceremony. But it was something that Dawson felt strongly about having a recording of. And so we switch almost to this like change into color of reminiscent of the Wizard of Oz. And this one is a little more intimate. There's just a few people. I'm not sure about the instruments, but it is interesting to see the difference in styles. You have men wearing button-up shirts and pants, flowing t-shirts and shorts. I also want to draw your attention to the man in the middle playing the behind the rounds thing. He's almost a dancing. His arms are moving. And we've jumped on to this. This I feel is a little bit more well known. This is the performance of the Gola people of Liberia. I say this based on the fact that Dawson's diary did mention the Gola, the Gebetu dancing devil, and there is a flag that at some point pops up as the Liberian flag. So as I was going through, as I said, he did mention seeing the Gebetu dancing devil on December 24th, 1952, which was when he was in Liberia. In that journal, Dawson also writes about recordings he makes of Gola and Bassa tribe, including songs and performances done by children ages from 3 to 6 years old. And unfortunately, we don't have film of those. He did mention that there was one little girl who was named Marian Anderson, and he really seemed to enjoy that. But back to this film, some of the sites that I looked up, according to the Brooklyn Museum's website, the Gebetu is a men's masquerade performed primarily for secular entertainment. It is a highly energetic, acrobatic performance with dancers advancing in broad swishing motions, making full use of this head-to-toe raffia covering. While this is performed by men, the Gebetu itself is considered to be feminine, as she is seen to give birth often to smaller dancing figures that appear to emerge from beneath that raffia skirt. The entry of the Brooklyn Museum also continues that each mask is actually owned, controlled, and performed by a specific household, which is known as the Gabanji, and it is also accompanied by its own proprietary music and choreography. According to an entry in Dawson's journal from December 31st, he does record dance of the Golas, which he writes in quotation marks. But he also notes that a young boy just out of the bush also performs. I'm not sure if this is the same performance, but it almost seems like someone from the audience jumps in and starts performing. I also like to take this moment to say that in his journal, Dawson does mention meeting a number of people who were very prominent in Liberia, including the president, President Tubman, as well as Max Bond, who was the president of the University of Liberia, and also the brother of Horace Mann Bond, whose papers we hold in the Rose Library. I'm including a little music here, and I'm going to try to talk over it. But according to his journal, Dawson was escorted by some people to the Lofa Gola chiefdom at Clay. This is in the northeastern area of Liberia. Dawson mentions that he met the paramount chief, Zwana Johnson, and witnessed the making of several clan chiefs. The Lofa Gola paramount chieftaincy was a cluster of the Gola, Dei, and Mixed Mandingo traditional chiefdoms near the coast. So here he's surrounded by women who are shaking instruments that appear to be ahakse shakers. I spent some time trying to compare the audio recordings in the Dawson papers to the performance, and I believe this might be the right recording. Now, I honestly probably shouldn't go into a lot of this because I'm far from an expert in Liberian history, but what I read in my research is that the Poro is actually a secret fraternal society in this area, and it incorporates the Gola, Temdi, Meddi, Vai, Capelli, Day, and Bassa tribes as members. So based on images that I found online, which were attributed to the Sjoerd Hofstra collection at the African Studies Center in the Netherlands, I'm going to identify this as a Poro costume based on the clothing. Also, I'm going to be using Dawson's journal as further evidence because he does write about recording music of the following tribes that I listed above. Now, these secret societies, both the Poro and the Sandi, which is the female component, teach young men and women domestic skills and knowledge that they will need as married adults. So the Poro Society is responsible for initiating boys into manhood, and it's secret in the sense that the information is passed from initiate to initiate, and is not necessarily shared widely. And that, you saw a little view of Gebetu in the background. So this masked performer, they appear not only in initiation ceremonies, but also other important social occasions. I can't say for sure that this is what it is based on the fact that it's so public, but I don't see very many women here, if at all. Well, I think there's one, but this could have been put on to show Dawson. It could have been something that's set up for him. And it almost sounds like a call and answer at one point in this music, which I think is very interesting and really kind of shows a sense of community. Now, this actually shows the change he made from Liberia into Ghana. I spent quite a bit of time, and I'll probably talk a little bit over this section because it's not very long. But in identifying this, I found that it was Ghanaian artist Kofi Atubin, and according to the journal that Dawson wrote, he left Monrovia on January 9th for Accra, Ghana. Now, that mosaic was actually found on the front of the Accra Community Center, and it reads, "There is strength in togetherness." One interesting thing was that in looking at the works of that artist, and Tubam, it was very similar to a lot of the works I saw when I processed the John Biggers collection that we held. He was an artist that was sent to Ghana on a United Nations fellowship and studied art there. So it does make sense that they are similar. Now, there is no real information about this performance. This is a girl who is dancing. At one point, I thought it might be something that Dawson mentions about an Iwu dancer, but she's young and she's excited to be showing this dance, and I just thought it was such an interesting performance. And at one point I did think that it might have been something that Dawson mentions about the Ghanaian educator and composer Philip Gebehu, who incidentally wrote the Ghanaian national anthem. And it made me realize that, Emory does have a history with national anthems, since Rose Library is the holding organization of the Korean national anthem that was composed by Yun Chi Ho, who is an alumni of Emory. Now, as I said, I don't think that this is the dance that Dawson mentions, but I did want to include it as a performance of music and to kind of show that almost everywhere he went, there was music. This appears to be more what I think Dawson is describing when he talks about the dancers in that one entry. However, this was Kumasi, as evidenced by that sign that you just saw. The ADCA Society, I could not find any information about that. I did find there was a group that is the African Deaf Culture and Art Society of Kumasi, but I'm not sure that this would be the same group. However, Dawson did attend a musical performance presented by several choirs and various solos, both vocal and instrumental. And I actually found a program from that performance. It was set up by the Kumasi Music Festival Association. It was a variety concert at Prempeh Hall. Now, it doesn't appear to be this because that performance included lots of piano solos and choir performances from composers such as Mendelssohn and Handel, but you can see a lot of movement, and especially here, you see a lot of color. You see two men performing with scarves. Now, what I have learned about the EU performance is that it tends to be women with white scarves. Now, I'm not saying that this is that or isn't that, but I do know that there was another performance where the dance itself used hands and body motions to convey stories. And you can see a lot of that in this performance where they are moving with their hands, but also using the scarves to show some kind of flow. We can watch this for a little bit. Oh, there's one drop. He picks it back up. So there is, and it seems like a pretty small performance. There's not a lot of people surrounding them, but you can see some people in the background watching. I'm not sure if there's a uniform with the yellow robe. And it's these points that I was really disappointed that the film itself did not have music or sound with it, because I think that it would have really added a lot to what you're seeing here. But as you can see, you can see the drummers, you can see the dancers, and there's a little more motion. And if you look at what the drummers are holding, the sticks, they are not what we normally conventionally think of as drumsticks. Our drumsticks are normally straight. These are more of an L shaped, where they use the point to actually drum. And here you can see that the man kind of in the back, well, actually, no, he's using the pointy thing too. At one point, I thought that he might have been using the other, but it does look like the way of drumming does use the point of that L. And so we switched to drummers who are no longer using the sticks, they're using their hands. So I'm not really sure if this is the same performance or even the same space. But in this one, you start to see more women in the audience. And per his January 18th entry, he heard and saw a native dance in Kumasi, and he made a movie of the Agbazda dance. And that could have been the previous dance, or it could have been this one coming up. But he did say that it was wonderfully energetic and muscular, which makes me think it might be this performance right here, this dance. And if you look in the background, you can also see people in the front row with the Hatsi shakers again. But then you start to see some more women getting involved, the woman who just passed. And it does seem like a much smaller space. And you can even see some of the people in the audience um, getting a little more involved. And here you start seeing more women. Now, as I mentioned before, the EU, EWEEU, dancing is typically women. And you start to see some more women here with the white scarves, especially right there with their performance. And so I'm assuming that this could be that performance that he was speaking about earlier. And there is singing, but unfortunately, again, we don't have the sound that matches up to this. Now, Dawson's entry on January 16th, 1953 includes that he heard Mr. Amu's male choir in African songs. Based on my extensive research, which means I Googled, this does appear to look, the man on the right there leading and conducting, look like Ephraim Amu leading a choir. Now, from an article that I found by George Wachowski Quasi-Dor, an article in the Journal of International Library of African Music, he notes that, and I'm going to make this quote, Amu epitomized the ideal personality of an African who took pride in his own indigenous culture. His pathfinding advocacy in thought and deed towards salvaging traditional African culture from the overbearing Western cultural presence in Africa remains exemplary. Amu was also a major proponent of wearing the kente cloth. And while I looked up and did some research, I don't know enough to say whether all of these men are wearing specifically kente cloth, because I think that it has a distinct pattern system. But at one point, I really did think that they were just kind of standing and chatting. But as you kind of look, you can see there's a lot more musicality to what they're doing. And of course, you have Mr. Amu, who is, you know, conducting in a very traditional, well, a European traditional way. Now, it all seems very staid. They're standing and they're, very strong. But at one point, you're going to see some drummers come in, and it's really going to change the dynamic of the group. And it also, I just wanted to know that in Dawson's journal, he did mention that while he was in this area, he was actually a house guest of Mr. Amu. So here you see the musical accompaniment. The drummers have changed it. There's a lot more energy and movement in this performance than there was in the one that was just previous to it. In addition, Dawson noted recording multiple performances of songs by Mr. Amu's male singers, and those recordings are also held in the Rose Library. Now, this is less a performance, and it feels like it's more just members of what I believe are the Krogo tribe enjoying music while they're in the market. So they're surrounded by others. You can see some people clapping along, but they do stand out due to the garments that they're wearing, which are primarily beads or fabric around their waist, and the hats that are basket made. And I'm not really sure if those are actual waist beads, because I believe there's a lot of information that talks about them being related to fertility. And as you can see, there's some young children there. But I don't know what Dawson's point was in recording this, but whether it's to show particular movement or the dress or the look of the women and children, or if it's just to capture something else, captures people just hearing music and being, moved to dance. There is a line in one of his journal entries where he says he went to the market and the air was just filled with music. And this could be a reference to that line. Now, jumping from someone who was in the market dancing to this, it almost feels like he kind of stumbled upon these women who were, doing chores. There's laundry hanging in the background, and that they were dancing and singing. But I don't do this, so I don't know. But as you see, they are, engaged in a community activity. They are in a circle. They're clapping and singing. And as they continue to do this, it gets a little more animated and excited. As you see here, there's more jumping, there's kicking up of the feet. And I love just to see their faces. In a lot of these performances, you don't get the close-ups of the faces, but there you really did. It kind of reminds me of that earlier scene with the young girl who was dancing. And this just it almost feels like the culmination of everything. There's this large audience. You have the women who are dancing with the white scarves again. You have people in the audience. There's the men doing almost the same dance as they were doing in an earlier scene. And I thought this actually was from that earlier scene, but they are actually different people, different clothes. There's a young girl sitting there dancing too. Someone in the audience who looks like they're just drumming along. And again, I don't know whether this kind of performance was something where everyone came ready to perform and ready to be involved. Some of the people in that front row especially have the shakers, or whether they're part of the performance, whether this is something that is planned. But You can see there's a lot of excitement, especially in the first couple of rows. People in the back tend to just be sitting back and watching. Again, based on just the dancing, the music had to be incredibly, excited and energetic. And if I could have found the corresponding music, I would have included it, but because I wasn't sure, I didn't. There's people in the audience who are also singing, dancing, especially that whole row of women. And I believe this is the same area. It was just a different aspect, different scene. And I almost didn't include this because I wanted to make sure that I had the background. But it was an interesting thing to see a gathering for a speaker, especially after all of this like musical performance, and you see someone actually coming to speak. People are here celebrating. But the best that I can decipher from both the internet and from Dawson's personal journal is that this is the leadership of Salt Pond, Ghana, which may have been called Akinfu, which I found in Dawson's journal. Now, on January 26th, Dawson explained that Mr. Amua Seki, who I believe might be Kweku Amua Seki, who at this time would be a future Supreme Court Justice of Ghana, was actually John O.H. Amaki's cousin. And Amua Seki actually brought Dawson to Salt Pond to witness what he quoted saying as Amaki's realities. The next day, Dawson lists speeches to Amaki by his people in his journal. And so based on a Google image search, I went through and I tried to really identify if these could be the same people because Kweku Amua Seki is so prominent. I tried to really use him to see if I could identify. And the man in the middle there does have a striking resemblance. So I am going to assume that that is John O.H. Amaki. But I'm not sure who the other people who are standing with him are. Some of them appear to be women. There are a few men. But based on this image, I believe that's who he is. And it's just a close-up of the faces. And it does remind me when I was a kid, whenever you watch someone's home video, you always have people who were just standing still, like they were getting ready to take a picture, not realizing that there's actually video that you want movement. And this is another scene that I included just because I like the imagery of it. It is a man. He obviously looks important. He has this hat or headdress. He has beads and jewelry on and these beautiful robes. And there's a number of people taking video and pictures of him. They set up this scene for him where someone will bring out a chair, which almost acts as a throne. And I'm basing that on that because when you see the scene, you'll see that when he walks out to it, it's, very stylized. There is, this man with the almost like pampas grass or feathers is he's holding, and he walks out and you can see he sits down on this, and there's like an African lion, or sorry, there's a lion skin there, and he, spreads out all of his regalia. There's someone who's spreading everything out underneath him. You also see a man in uniform there. And I was really hoping that like trying to identify that uniform would give me more information. But based on what I could find, it looks either like the West African the Royal West African Frontier Force uniform, or possibly the British King's African Rifles, which were both active in West Africa during World War II through 1957, when Ghana actually gained its own independence, or previously known as the British colony of the Gold Coast, and now Ghana. And it is important to note that the cummerbund and the fez are both black, not red, which I believe probably means something. But I love this kind of video. And you can see that like he walks out and he comes back, and it's obviously being staged so they can record it. And I do just want to take this time to thank you for watching this video and being a part of Home Movie Day. I really had a great time learning so much about our recordings and our information here, being able to share that.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura. So those are some of the home movies in Emory's collections, but if you're watching this, you or someone in your family may have home movies too, and those films are important. They're important to your family, but also potentially to historians and scholars. We don't always think of home movies as historical documents, but as the Center for Home Movies says, in 100 years and even today, your home movies will contain unique and precious documentation of a way of life. So whether that's contemporary clothing styles or locations or events that may change over the course of time, that information is important. So let's talk now about how to take care of home movies. Most importantly, keep the original films. Film is actually very stable if kept in the right environment and can last for a long time, much longer than a VHS tape or DVD typically. The technology to digitize and view films will change over time, but if you have the originals in good condition, you can always make new viewing copies. So what is a good environment for film? Generally, it's someplace cool and dry and away from hot temperatures, high humidity, and dampness. You want to avoid things like a hot attic or a damp basement or a garage where the temperature fluctuates a lot. You want someplace cool, stable, and out of direct sunlight. And then you also want to store your film in a container that it can breathe in rather than something airtight. So if they're in the original cardboard box or a film can that isn't tightly closed, those are both good options. If they're in plastic bags, it's probably better to take them out so they have some airflow. If you're interested in additional resources on home movies, we have some links for you. The first is the Center for Home Movies. This site has guidance on caring for home movies, advice on transferring films to digital formats, and links to service providers for that. So if you have home movies and they're not in great shape, if they seem warped or they're giving off kind of a vinegary smell, those are signs that the film is deteriorating and you may want to have a digital copy made. So this is a good place to find a site to do that. Film Forever is also a great resource for preserving films at home. You can find a lot of information on inspecting your films, cleaning them, repairs, digitization, storage, equipment suppliers, really all sorts of things. And lastly, if you're interested in exploring donating your films to Emory, you can reach out to Rose Library, and here is that email address. So we hope that this has been an interesting look into the film collections at Emory. If you want to explore home movies even further, you can also visit the Center for Home Movies website and find links to Home Movie Day events happening all over. So you can check out other Home Movie Day events happening this October and really anytime. Thank you all so much for joining us for Home Movie Day.